It began not with a gunshot, but with a quiet, growing tension, a friction between a distant empire and a cluster of small colonies that had been born on its frontiers. For decades, the 13 British colonies in North America had lived in what many historians call salutary neglect, a long period in which London largely allowed them to manage their own affairs. Colonists elected their own assemblies, enforced their own laws, and built an identity that was British in culture yet distinctly American in character. But this balance shattered in the mid-1700s, when the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, dragged the British Empire into enormous debt. The war had been fought to protect the colonies, or so the Crown insisted, and now the colonies, London argued, would have to help pay the cost. That reasoning would ignite one of the most consequential political rebellions in human history. After the war ended, Britain emerged as the world's dominant imperial power, controlling more territory than ever before. But victory came with a price. The treasury was bleeding. Parliament believed that the colonists, who had benefited directly from military protection, should contribute through new taxes. To London, this was logical. To the colonists, it felt like a betrayal. They had already sacrificed lives and resources fighting alongside British troops. So when the Sugar Act of 1764 imposed the first major tax, resentment stirred. When the Stamp Act of 1765 followed, resentment erupted into outright rage. Colonists argued not against taxes themselves, but against the idea that they could be levied without the consent of their own elected assemblies. Thus, the now famous cry took shape: no taxation without representation. Yet Britain was unmoved. Parliament insisted it had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonies countered that they were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, which included political representation. This clash over constitutional principles, more than any single tax, was the first spark of revolution. Across the colonies, resistance organizations formed. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine group led by powerful figures such as Samuel Adams, orchestrated protests, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience. Newspapers printed fiery pamphlets condemning British tyranny, and common citizens began to question the legitimacy of imperial authority. In London, these protests appeared dangerous, even rebellious. So Britain doubled down. Troops were stationed in Boston in 1768 to maintain order, but their presence only intensified anger. Colonists felt they were being occupied by their own government. The tension finally exploded on the night of March 5, 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd during a chaotic street confrontation. 5 colonists died. Patriots labeled it the Boston Massacre, and though the term was political propaganda, the event symbolized a turning point. Blood had been spilled. The relationship between colony and empire was breaking. Despite rising tensions, a full-scale revolution did not yet seem inevitable. Many colonists still identified as loyal British subjects. They wanted rights, not independence. But Britain's next decision would push the colonies firmly onto the path of rebellion. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the struggling British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. While the tax on tea was actually reduced, the principle remained: Parliament was still taxing them without their consent. In Boston, resistance reached its peak when a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This Boston Tea Party was not merely vandalism, it was an open challenge to imperial authority. London's response was devastatingly harsh. Determined to make an example of Massachusetts, Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed. Local assemblies were dissolved. Town meetings were banned. British officials accused of crimes were to be tried in England, not in the colonies. It was a calculated effort to crush resistance and intimidate the other colonies into submission. But the plan backfired dramatically. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain united the colonies in outrage. What began as a regional rebellion transformed into a continental movement. In 1774, colonial delegates met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, representing a collective American political body for the first time in history. They coordinated boycotts, drafted petitions, and established networks of communication and defense. They did not yet speak of independence, not openly, but the idea was taking root. Colonists were beginning to imagine a future not under the British crown but of their own making. The Empire, however, saw this as dangerous sedition. By early 1775, the situation was trembling on the edge of war. British General Thomas Gage received orders to suppress the growing rebellion and seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. What he did not know was that colonial spies, including Paul Revere and other patriots, had infiltrated British ranks and were preparing for the first clash. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, only to be confronted by a small militia in the town of Lexington. The confrontation lasted seconds. A mysterious shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. Word of the skirmish spread rapidly across the colonies. Farmers, blacksmiths, and ordinary laborers grabbed muskets and assembled as militias. Within days, thousands surrounded Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city. For the first time, the colonies had taken up arms against the world's most powerful empire. Few believed they could win. Britain had the largest navy on Earth, a professional army, vast financial resources, and a global network of allies and colonies. The American rebels had almost none of these advantages. Yet they possessed something the empire lacked, a shared cause, fueled by resentment, hope, and a belief that they were fighting not only for rights but for the future of an entire continent. As the smoke of Lexington and Concord cleared, a question emerged that would shape the destiny of millions. Could 13 small, scattered colonies truly stand against the British Empire? And if they tried, what kind of nation would rise from the ashes of rebellion? The greatest struggle of the 18th century was about to begin. The aftermath of Lexington and Concord sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. The British Empire had expected a brief show of force to silence dissent, but instead it ignited a full-scale uprising. As militia forces poured in from across New England, the siege of Boston tightened, transforming the once bustling port city into the epicenter of an armed rebellion. British General Thomas Gage reported with growing frustration that the colonists were not dispersing, they were organizing. What had begun as a local dispute over political rights was rapidly evolving into a continental struggle for autonomy. Yet even as muskets were raised, many colonists still held on to the fragile hope that reconciliation with Britain might be possible. The next months would shatter that hope. In May 1775, while Boston remained under siege, delegates from all 13 colonies reassembled in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. This was no ordinary political gathering. Men who had risked charges of treason now entered Independence Hall with the fate of an entire continent hanging in the balance. Among them were figures whose names would echo through history: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. They were divided, uncertain, and, in many cases, deeply afraid. Calling for independence was still considered radical, even dangerous. But they knew they had to respond to the violence unfolding in Massachusetts. The Congress moved cautiously but decisively. It formed the Continental Army, a unified fighting force for all the colonies, and appointed George Washington, a tall Virginia planter known for his dignity and his service in the French and Indian War, as its commander. Washington's selection was strategic. The rebellion had begun in New England, but independence would require the support of the southern colonies. Washington's leadership symbolized unity, not a regional revolt but a collective American struggle. When he arrived outside Boston that summer, he found an army brave but untrained, passionate but poorly supplied. Militiamen lacked uniforms, discipline, and even basic weapons. Some had no muskets at all. Others carried hunting rifles or farm tools. It was a far cry from the professional soldiers of the British Army. But Washington understood that his task was not merely military. He had to forge a national identity from a patchwork of colonies that previously had little reason to trust one another. Before Washington could fully take command, blood was once again spilled on the hills surrounding Boston. In June 1775, British forces launched a massive assault on colonial defenders entrenched on Breed's Hill, mistakenly remembered as Bunker Hill. The colonists, dug into crude fortifications, prepared for the worst. They knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Ammunition was so scarce that Commander William Prescott reportedly ordered his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British charged uphill in tight formation, confident that their discipline would crush the rebels quickly. But twice they were driven back by deadly colonial fire. On the third assault, with the defenders nearly out of ammunition, the British finally seized the hill. It was technically a British victory, but the cost stunned the empire: over 1,000 casualties, far more than the colonists suffered. The message was clear: this would not be a simple rebellion to extinguish. The American colonists would fight with determination, even against overwhelming odds. Despite the violence, the Second Continental Congress made one last attempt to avoid full separation. Many delegates still believed that loyalty to the Crown could be preserved if Parliament would simply respect their rights. In July 1775, they approved the Olive Branch Petition, a heartfelt appeal sent directly to King George III. It expressed devotion to the monarchy while pleading for an end to hostilities and a restoration of peace. But the king refused to read it. He declared the colonies to be an open rebellion and promised stern punishment for the traitors who dared defy imperial authority. His rejection was the breaking point. Any illusion of compromise evaporated. The colonists now understood that loyalty to the king was no longer compatible with the desire for liberty. As summer turned to fall, the war expanded beyond New England. American commanders launched an ambitious and controversial invasion of Canada, hoping to convince French-speaking Canadians to join the uprising. Generals Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold led separate forces through brutal winter conditions, marching through snow, ice, and dense forests. The campaign ended in disaster outside Quebec City with Montgomery dead and Arnold wounded. Yet even in failure, the invasion revealed a critical truth: the Americans no longer viewed themselves as mere subjects resisting policy changes. They were fighting as a people pursuing a continental revolution. Meanwhile, pamphlets circulated throughout the colonies, shaping public opinion as powerfully as any rifle shot. None would be more influential than Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776. Written in clear, fiery language, it dismantled the argument for monarchy, denounced hereditary rule, and insisted that America's future lay not with Britain but with independence. Paine's words resonated deeply with ordinary colonists, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, who had never before considered breaking ties with the Crown. In just a few months, Common Sense sold more than 100,000 copies, an astonishing number for its time. It transformed the conversation. Independence was no longer the dream of a radical few, it was becoming a mainstream demand. By spring 1776, Britain escalated its military response. Massive fleets crossed the Atlantic, carrying thousands of soldiers, including hired Hessian mercenaries from Germany. The Empire believed that overwhelming force would bring the colonies to their knees. But such displays of power only hardened American resolve. The arrival of Hessians, foreign troops brought in to suppress British subjects, was seen by many colonists as the ultimate betrayal. If the Crown would hire outsiders to kill them, then reconciliation was impossible. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress faced the most momentous decision in American history. For months, heated debates filled the hall as the delegates weighed the costs and consequences of independence. Fear lingered. Failure meant execution. Success meant building a new nation from the ground up. Yet the momentum was unstoppable. Colony after colony instructed its delegates to vote in favor of separation. And so, on July 2, 1776, the Congress approved a resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. 2 days later, on July 4, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, a bold statement of political philosophy and human rights that would echo across centuries. The colonies had crossed a line from which there was no return. The world now understood that this was not a protest or a temporary disturbance. It was a revolution. But Britain, the world's most powerful empire, had no intention of letting its colonies go without a fight. The full might of imperial warfare was about to descend upon the newborn United States. The question was no longer whether Americans would seek independence. The question was whether they could possibly survive long enough to achieve it. When the Declaration of Independence spread across the colonies and was read aloud in town squares, taverns, and meeting halls, celebrations erupted. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and newspapers printed the bold words that proclaimed a new nation. But beneath the patriotic excitement lay a grim and sobering truth: the United States was now at war against the most powerful empire on earth. Britain possessed a professional army trained in European warfare, the world's strongest navy, and the financial resources of a global empire. the Americans had enthusiasm, determination, and a vision of liberty, but little else. Their Continental Army was small, poorly supplied, and inexperienced. Many doubted it could withstand a single major British offensive. And that offensive was already on its way. In the summer of 1776, Britain launched the largest invasion force it had ever assembled for a colonial conflict. More than 30,000 British and Hessian troops, supported by a massive fleet, arrived in New York Harbor. Their goal was simple: crush the rebellion in one decisive blow. New York, with its strategic port and central location, became the battleground where the fate of the Revolution would be tested. Washington rushed to defend the city, but he knew the odds were against him. His army was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and most of his soldiers had never faced a professional army in open battle. Still, retreating without a fight would have devastated morale. So Washington prepared for what he feared might be the darkest chapter of the Revolution. The British struck first on Long Island in August 1776. Their attack was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Using flanking maneuvers and superior firepower, they routed the Americans, forcing Washington into a desperate retreat. The Continental Army narrowly escaped complete annihilation thanks to a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River, carried out under the cover of thick fog that many soldiers described as an act of divine intervention. It was one of the most dramatic escapes in military history, but victory for the British seemed all but certain. In the weeks that followed, Washington suffered defeat after defeat. He was pushed out of New York City, then across New Jersey, and finally toward the Delaware River. Newspapers mocked him. British officers boasted that the rebellion would collapse within weeks. Even members of Congress began to worry that the revolution was dying almost as soon as it had begun. By December 1776, the situation had become desperate. Thousands of soldiers had deserted. Supplies were dwindling. And the Continental Army was shrinking as enlistments expired. Washington faced the possibility that, come January, he might not have an army at all. In Philadelphia, Congress fled the city, fearing a British advance. The dream of independence seemed on the edge of extinction. Yet in this bleak moment, Washington refused to give up. He believed that a bold strike, a daring, unexpected blow, might revive the army's spirit and restore the nation's hope. What he planned next would become legendary. On the night of December 25, 1776, as snow and ice blanketed the Delaware River, Washington led his remaining troops across the freezing waters. Many soldiers had no shoes. Ice slammed against the boats. The storm nearly derailed the operation. But Washington pressed on, determined to strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton by surprise. At dawn, the Americans attacked with ferocity. The stunned Hessians, unprepared for battle, surrendered after a brief but intense fight. It was not just a victory, it was a lifeline. News of the triumph electrified the colonies. Only days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces and forcing them to retreat to New Brunswick. These twin victories breathed new life into the Revolution, convincing many that the Americans could indeed challenge the empire. But the war was far from won. In 1777, Britain launched a new strategy: cut off New England, the heart of the rebellion, by seizing control of the Hudson River. General John Burgoyne led a large army south from Canada, planning to meet British forces marching north from New York City. If the plan succeeded, the colonies would be split in two, strangling the Revolution. But Burgoyne underestimated the Americans and the harshness of the wilderness. His army faced constant attacks from patriot militias, supply shortages, and difficult terrain. By the time they reached near Saratoga, exhaustion had set in. Meanwhile, American General Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold prepared to confront the British with a growing army. The battles of Saratoga, fought in September and October 1777, changed everything. Arnold's fearless leadership and the determination of American troops forced Burgoyne into a corner. Cut off, surrounded, and out of options, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. It was one of the most significant defeats in British military history. News of Saratoga rippled across the Atlantic, shocking the British government and electrifying European powers. For the first time, foreign nations saw the American cause not as a hopeless rebellion, but as a legitimate fight for independence. And one nation, in particular, took notice: France. France had long despised Britain and saw an opportunity to weaken its greatest rival. Influential figures such as Benjamin Franklin, who had been charming French society with his wit and diplomacy, urged the French crown to support the American revolutionaries. Saratoga provided the proof France needed: the colonies could win. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an American ally, supplying money, troops, ships, and international legitimacy. The revolution was no longer a colonial uprising, it had become an international conflict. Britain now faced not only rebellious colonies but also France's powerful navy and global influence. Yet even with French support, the war grew only more brutal. The British shifted their focus to the south, capturing Savannah and Charleston, unleashing loyalist militias, and waging devastating campaigns across the Carolinas. Washington's army, worn down by years of hardship, endured bitter winters, including the infamous encampment at Valley Forge, where soldiers froze, starved, and battled disease. But under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, the Continental Army transformed. Drills, discipline, and modern tactics turned Washington's men into a professional fighting force capable of standing toe-to-toe with British troops. The Revolution had survived its darkest days. The Americans had suffered defeat, hunger, despair, and near collapse, yet they endured. Now, with a revitalized army and a powerful ally, they prepared for the battles that would decide the war's final outcome. The Empire had underestimated the colonies. But could the colonies truly defeat the Empire? The answer would unfold in the final tumultuous years of the war. By 1779, the American Revolution had become a grinding, uncertain, and often brutal conflict. The British, frustrated by their inability to crush the rebellion in the north, shifted their strategy dramatically. They turned their attention to the south, convinced that the region was full of loyalists who would rise up and help restore imperial control. At first, the strategy seemed sound. In 1778, British forces seized Savannah, and by 1780 they captured Charleston, taking thousands of American soldiers prisoner. It was one of the worst defeats the Continental Army had suffered. To the British High Command, it seemed the rebellion was finally collapsing. But beneath the surface, a different reality was taking shape, one that would ultimately shatter the Empire's plans. The Southern Campaign awakened a ferocious resistance among ordinary colonists. Small bands of patriots, led by men like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, launched daring guerrilla attacks on British supply lines. They struck quickly, vanished into forests and swamps, and slowly eroded the enemy's control. British officers dismissed them as criminals or irregulars, but their tactics proved devastatingly effective. Every convoy that was ambushed, every patrol that disappeared in the Carolina backcountry, weakened the image of British invincibility. As British forces spread across vast territories, they discovered that occupying land was easy, but holding it was almost impossible. At the same time, the Continental Army, despite its losses, was learning to fight with new discipline. The months spent at Valley Forge under the training of Baron von Steuben had reshaped the army into a more cohesive force. Washington's men were no longer the desperate militia bands of 1776, they were soldiers who understood European tactics and could match British troops in open battle. This transformation became tragically evident at the Battle of Camden in 1780, where American General Horatio Gates suffered a disastrous defeat. But instead of breaking the cause, Camden paved the way for new leadership. Congress appointed Nathanael Greene, a quiet, determined Rhode Islander, to command the Southern forces. Greene studied the enemy carefully and realized that he could not win a traditional war. Instead, he adopted a strategy that would become legendary: we fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. Greene divided his forces, forcing the British to chase them across hundreds of miles. Each pursuit exhausted their supplies, stretched their lines thin, and left them vulnerable to attack. Greene's men fought in places like Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and Eutaw Springs, delivering blows that, while not always decisive on the battlefield, slowly drained the British Army's strength. The British won some fights, but at staggering costs. It became clear that the Empire was bleeding resources faster than it could replace them. Meanwhile, a new British commander, General Charles Cornwallis, grew increasingly frustrated. He believed that smashing Greene's army was the key to ending the rebellion in the South. But Greene refused to be destroyed. Every time Cornwallis pushed forward, Greene slipped away, forcing the British deeper into a hostile region with few loyal supporters. Cornwallis made a fateful decision, one that would unknowingly set the stage for the end of the war. Instead of continuing the exhausting campaign in the Carolinas, he marched his army north into Virginia, determined to strike at American supply centers and deliver a final, decisive victory. But Washington and his French allies saw Cornwallis's movement as the opportunity they had been waiting for. For years, Washington had dreamed of attacking the British in New York, but he knew that his army alone could not overpower the strong British defenses there. Everything changed in 1781, when the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed toward the American coast. Instead of heading for New York, de Grasse moved south to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington immediately understood the significance. If the French could control the bay, Cornwallis would be trapped in Virginia. Abandoning his long-held plan to liberate New York, Washington acted with lightning speed. In an extraordinary feat of deception and logistics, he marched the Continental Army more than 400 miles south toward Yorktown, while sending out false signals that convinced British commanders that New York was still the main target. Cornwallis, meanwhile, had fortified Yorktown, believing the British Navy would protect him. But when de Grasse's fleet met the British Navy in the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French won a stunning victory. For the first time in the war, the British Navy, the pride of the Empire, was shut out. Cornwallis was now isolated. No reinforcements. No escape. No control of the bay. As American and French soldiers encircled Yorktown, Cornwallis found himself facing a force far stronger than he had anticipated. The Siege of Yorktown, which began in September 1781, marked the climax of the American Revolution. American and French artillery pounded British positions day and night. Washington personally oversaw the construction of trenches and fortifications, refusing to let his troops falter. The Franco-American alliance, once doubted by many, now stood as the decisive factor in the war. French soldiers, led by the Marquis de Lafayette and General Rochambeau, fought side by side with American troops, showing a unity that stunned the British. On the night of October 14, American forces attacked two crucial British redoubts. One was stormed by French troops, the other by Americans led by Alexander Hamilton. Fighting was fierce and swift. When the redoubts fell, Cornwallis's lines collapsed. Surrounded, outgunned, and unable to break free, Cornwallis recognized the truth: the British position was hopeless. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his army, more than 7,000 soldiers, to Washington and his allies. The world was shocked. A group of former colonies had defeated one of the most powerful armies on earth. Word of the surrender rippled across Europe, shaking governments and altering the balance of global power. In London, Parliament was stunned into silence. Many British leaders argued that continuing the war was pointless. The Empire could still fight on, but the cost of recapturing the colonies, in money, manpower, and prestige, would be enormous. For the first time, the British government acknowledged the unthinkable: the American colonies might truly be lost. Though fighting would continue in scattered regions for several months, Yorktown was the breaking point, the moment the Empire finally bowed to the will of a determined, united people. The war for independence was nearly over. But the battle to define the new nation was only just beginning. The surrender at Yorktown stunned the world, but the Americans knew the struggle was not entirely finished. Despite the dramatic defeat, Britain still controlled New York City, Charleston, Savannah, and several frontier posts. The Royal Navy remained powerful, and some in the British government argued for continuing the fight to preserve imperial honor. Yet the stunning loss of a full British army had changed everything. Parliament, weary of years of war, suffering from mounting debt, and pressured by merchants whose businesses had collapsed under wartime disruption, began to push for negotiation. The tide of political opinion in London shifted. War hawks were replaced with moderates. For the first time, the British government acknowledged what would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier: the United States of America would become an independent nation. But independence was not granted instantly. It required months of complex diplomacy, careful negotiation, and strategic patience. In Paris, American diplomats, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked tirelessly to secure a peace that recognized the new nation's rights and territory. They were skilled negotiators, aware that European politics were tangled with rivalries, ambitions, and shifting alliances. France had supported the Americans in the war, but the Americans knew France had its own interests and might limit American gains to keep the new nation dependent. Britain, desperate but proud, hoped to retain influence. The Americans maneuvered through this diplomatic maze with surprising sophistication. John Jay, suspicious of French intentions, insisted on negotiating directly with the British. Britain, eager to drive a wedge between the Americans and the French, agreed. The result was the Treaty of Paris of 1783, a document that shocked the world with its generosity toward the new United States. Britain recognized American independence, granted vast territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and secured fishing rights off Newfoundland for American vessels. It was a diplomatic triumph. Overnight, the 13 former colonies transformed into a nation with immense land and potential. As news of the treaty spread across the American states, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang, cannons thundered, and crowds gathered to hear public readings. After 8 long years of war, marked by hunger, despair, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve, the dream of independence had come true. Yet the euphoria was tempered by uncertainty. The war had been won, but the future remained unclear. The United States was free, but it was fragile. Its army was exhausted, its economy battered, and its political system untested. Many wondered whether the new republic could survive. In late 1783, George Washington, the commander who had led the Continental Army through defeat and victory, through starvation and triumph, made a decision that astonished the world. He resigned his commission and returned to private life at Mount Vernon. In an era when victorious generals often seized power and became dictators, Washington's act shocked monarchs and inspired ordinary people everywhere. King George III reportedly said that if Washington truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. Washington's resignation became one of the defining moments of the Revolution, proof that the new nation would not replicate the tyranny it had fought against. But victory did not erase the challenges facing the new country. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak, unable to tax, regulate trade, or unify the states effectively. Economic chaos swept across regions. States quarreled over borders and trade policies. Soldiers who had fought for independence returned home to find unpaid wages, high taxes, and debt. Protests, most famously Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, signaled deep unrest. Many feared that the fragile republic might dissolve before it truly began. Yet the same determination that had won the war now drove Americans to confront their internal problems. In 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia to create a stronger and more functional government. What emerged was the United States Constitution, a bold and innovative framework that balanced federal power with states' rights, established an independent judiciary, and created a system of checks and balances to prevent tyranny. The Constitution was not perfect, it left unresolved issues that would haunt the nation for generations, but it provided the structure necessary for the United States to survive and grow. As the 1780s turned to the 1790s, the new nation began to stabilize. George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States, a sign of the immense trust and respect he commanded. The former colonies, once divided by region, religion, and local interests, slowly began to function as a unified republic. Roads expanded, trade increased, and new states formed in the Western territories. Though conflicts, political rivalries, and foreign threats remained, the United States had taken the first crucial steps toward nationhood. The revolution had not been merely a war of muskets and cannons. It had been a revolution of ideas, the belief that ordinary people could govern themselves, that sovereignty could rest in the hands of citizens rather than kings, that liberty could be protected by law. These ideas resonated far beyond America's borders. The American Revolution inspired uprisings, political reforms, and independence movements around the world. It challenged monarchies and reshaped global power dynamics. It proved that empires were not invincible, that even a collection of small colonies, when united by purpose and driven by conviction, could topple a global giant. The question remains, how did 13 colonies take down an empire? The answer lies in a combination of extraordinary factors: relentless determination, strategic leadership, foreign alliances, and the willingness of ordinary people to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves. It lies in the failures of an empire that underestimated its opponent and misunderstood the power of shared ideals. And it lies in the courage of men and women who believed that a different world was possible, and who risked their lives to create it. When the war began, few believed the colonies could win. By the time it ended, they had done more than achieve independence. They had set in motion the creation of a nation that would, in time, reshape the course of human history. The British Empire lost a set of colonies. The world gained the United States of America.